The music pulsed through Nora Harmon's body as she sat at the edge of the crowded hotel bar, nursing her drink and wondering how she'd let her friends talk her into coming out tonight, when all she'd wanted was a quiet evening with a good book and her cat. "You can't hide from life forever," her best friend Melissa had insisted earlier, practically shoving the sleek black dress into Nora's reluctant hands. "This charity gala is exactly what you need: fancy drinks, good cause, and absolutely zero pressure." Zero pressure. Right. Nora took another sip of her gin and tonic, feeling distinctly out of place among the glittering crowd. At 28, she was comfortable with her life, a stable job as a physical therapist, a cozy apartment, and a carefully constructed routine that rarely included events like this. The annual fundraiser for children's medical research was certainly worthy, but she'd only agreed to come after Melissa had guilted her with talk of supporting sick kids and just one night out. Melissa and their other friend Kate had disappeared into the crowd almost immediately upon arrival, leaving Nora alone to alternate between people watching and checking the time on her phone. Just one more hour, she promised herself. "Is this seat taken?" Nora looked up to find a tall man gesturing to the empty bar stool beside her. His dark eyes caught the dim lighting in a way that made her pause before answering. "No, go ahead." She shifted slightly to give him more room. "Thanks." He sat down with an ease that suggested he was far more comfortable in this setting than she was. "Nick Ortega," he said, offering his hand. "Nora Harmon." His handshake was firm, but not overwhelming. "Not enjoying the party?" he asked, signaling the bartender. Nora gave a small laugh. "Is it that obvious?" "You have that look." He smiled, and she noticed the slight crinkle around his eyes. "Like you're mentally calculating how much longer you need to stay before making a polite exit." Guilty. She found herself smiling back. "I'm not really the gala type." "And what type are you, Nora Harmon?" he asked, accepting his whiskey from the bartender with a nod of thanks. She considered his question. "The type who'd rather be home with a good book and no shoes, honestly." "Sounds perfect, actually." He took a sip of his drink. "Though I hope you don't regret coming tonight, at least not completely." There was something refreshingly direct about him. He was handsome in a classic way, tall with broad shoulders, dark hair neatly styled, and wearing a perfectly tailored suit that suggested quality rather than flash. But it was his attentiveness that struck her most, the way he seemed genuinely interested in her answer. "The jury's still out," she replied, surprised at her own flirtatiousness. The conversation flowed easily after that. Nick was intelligent and funny, asking questions about her work as a physical therapist and actually listening to her answers. He told her he was in business, which was vague enough that Nora assumed he was probably middle management somewhere and didn't press further. When the band transitioned from background music to more upbeat dance numbers, Nora barely noticed until Nick set down his glass. "Would you dance with me?" he asked. Her immediate instinct was to refuse. "I'm not much of a dancer." "Neither am I," he confessed with a grin that suggested otherwise. "But I'm willing to risk public humiliation if you are." Something about his smile made her reconsider. "One dance," she conceded. "But fair warning, I have 2 left feet. I'll take my chances." Nick led her onto the dance floor, just as the band began a cover of an old jazz standard. He placed one hand gently on her waist, took her hand with the other, and before she knew it, they were moving together with surprising synchronicity. "I thought you said you couldn't dance," she accused as he guided her through a turn. "I said I wasn't much of a dancer, not that I couldn't dance," he corrected. "There's a difference." "Semantics," she laughed. "Precision," he countered, his eyes warm. "I'm very precise about the things that matter." One dance became 2, and then 3. Nora forgot about checking her phone, forgot about her escape plan, forgot about everything except the feeling of Nick's hand on her waist and the surprising ease between them. When a slower song began, Nick pulled her closer, and Nora didn't resist. There was something inexplicably right about being in his arms. "Thank you for dancing with me," he said softly near her ear. "Thank you for asking," she replied, and meant it. The evening stretched on, punctuated by more dancing, conversation at a quiet corner table, and laughter that came surprisingly easily. When Melissa found her around midnight, Her eyes widened at the sight of Nora deep in conversation with Nick. "There you are," Melissa exclaimed. "We're heading out. Want to share an Uber?" Nora hesitated, looking at Nick. "I'd be happy to make sure you get home safely," he offered, "if you'd like to stay a bit longer." "I think I'll stay," Nora told Melissa, ignoring her friend's raised eyebrows and suggestive smile. After Melissa left, they moved to the hotel's terrace. The night air was cool but pleasant, the city lights spreading out below them like fallen stars. "I'm glad you decided not to leave," Nick said, his voice quiet in the night. "Me too." And she was. Surprisingly so. "I never planned to dance tonight. Life's best moments often come unplanned." He smiled at her, and something fluttered in her chest. By the time the gala was winding down, Nora felt as though she'd known Nick for far longer than a few hours. They exchanged numbers, and when he asked if he could see her again, her yes came without hesitation. "I'll call you tomorrow," he promised as they stood outside the hotel, waiting for the valet to bring his car. "I'd like that," she replied. When his car arrived, a sleek black Aston Martin that made Nora blink in surprise, Nick noticed her expression. "Company car," he said with a casual shrug that didn't quite ring true. "Perks of the job." He drove her home, walked her to her door like a gentleman from another era, and kissed her cheek softly before saying goodnight. Nora fell asleep that night with a smile on her face, thinking about dark eyes and the unexpected joy of dancing in the arms of a stranger who didn't feel like a stranger at all. True to his word, Nick called the next day to ask her to dinner. Their first official date was at a small Italian restaurant that Nora had never heard of, but which served the best pasta she'd ever tasted. The second date was a walk through the botanical gardens, followed by ice cream from a local shop. On their third date, Nick took her sailing on a boat that he claimed belonged to a friend. It wasn't until their fourth date that Nora began to suspect there was more to Nick's business career than he'd let on. He'd invited her to a small gallery opening, and throughout the evening, she noticed how people deferred to him, how the gallery owner seemed particularly eager for his opinion on certain pieces. "Are you some kind of art collector?" she asked as they walked to a nearby cafe afterward. "I dabble," he admitted with a slight smile. "I've always appreciated art." "You do more than dabble," she challenged gently. The gallery owner practically genuflected when you walked in. Nick laughed, but there was a hint of something like discomfort in his expression. "I've bought a few pieces from him over the years. He's probably hoping I'll add to my collection." "And will you?" Nora asked, curious about this glimpse into a part of his life he seemed to keep carefully compartmentalized. "Maybe. There was one piece I thought you might like, that landscape with the stormy sky." She remembered it clearly, a dramatic seascape that somehow managed to convey both turbulence and serenity. "It was beautiful," she agreed. "Also probably costs more than I make in a year." "Beauty should be accessible to everyone," he said seriously. "Its value isn't in its price tag." It was that comment, more than anything else, that made her begin to fall for him in earnest. In the weeks that followed, Nora found herself drawn deeper into Nick's world, yet he remained somewhat enigmatic about his professional life. He was generous and attentive, but there were moments when he'd take calls in another room or make vague references to meetings that seemed to involve high-stakes decisions. "Do you trust me?" he asked her one evening as they sat on her small balcony, sharing a bottle of wine. "Of course," she answered without hesitation. "Why?" "I'd like to take you somewhere next weekend. It's a surprise, but it would involve a short flight." Nora raised her eyebrows. "A flight? That's quite a surprise." "You deserve extraordinary things," he said simply. The following weekend, Nora found herself boarding a private jet, still not knowing their destination. It wasn't until they began their descent that Nick revealed they were landing in Napa Valley. "Wine country?" she asked, delighted. "I thought you might enjoy it," he said, watching her face with evident pleasure at her reaction. "I have a small place here. Nothing fancy, but the view is nice." The small place turned out to be a stunning vineyard property with a Mediterranean-style villa overlooking rows of grapevines. Nora's steps faltered as they drove up the long, olive-lined driveway. "This is yours?" she asked, unable to keep the astonishment from her voice. Nick looked almost embarrassed. "It's an investment property, really." I don't get out here as often as I'd like. The weekend was magical private wine tastings, dinners under the stars, and long conversations that stretched into the night. It was on their last evening, as they sat on the terrace watching the sunset paint the vineyard in gold, that Nick finally opened up about his work. I should have been more forthcoming, he began, turning his wine glass slowly. The truth is, I'm the CEO of Ortega Investments. We specialize in sustainable development and tech ventures. Nora set her glass down carefully. Ortega Investments, the company that was on the cover of Business Monthly last year? He nodded, watching her closely. I don't generally lead with that information when I meet someone. It tends to change how people see me. And you're not just in business, she said, piecing together all the little inconsistencies that suddenly made sense. You're a guy who met an incredible woman at a charity gala and has been falling for her more each day, he interrupted gently. The rest is just context. Context that includes being a millionaire, she pointed out. Does it matter? He asked, and she could hear the genuine concern in his voice. Nora took a moment to consider how she felt. The man sitting across from her was the same person who had asked her to dance, who remembered how she took her coffee, who listened when she talked about her patient's progress. His bank account didn't change those things. No, she said finally. It doesn't change who you are to me, but I wish you told me sooner. I wanted to be sure you were getting to know me, not my net worth, he explained. In my experience, people's perceptions shift when they find out. I can understand that, she admitted, but relationships need honesty. You're right, he acknowledged, reaching for her hand. No more half-truths or omissions. I promise. That night, under a canopy of stars, Nick told her the full story of building his company from the ground up, of the risks and sacrifices, the failures and successes. He spoke of his passion for investing in sustainable technologies and his foundation that provided educational opportunities for underprivileged kids. Why children's education? She asked, genuinely curious. My mother was a teacher in a low-income district, he explained. She showed me how much difference one person can make in a child's life. When I had the means to help, it seemed like the most natural way to honor her work. By the time they returned to the city, something had shifted between them. The last barrier of uncertainty had fallen away, leaving a clarity that was both exhilarating and terrifying in its intensity. As spring turned to summer, Nora found herself adapting to certain aspects of Nick's lifestyle. Charity galas became less intimidating, and she grew comfortable with the occasional luxury that he insisted on sharing with her. But she maintained her independence, keeping her apartment and her job, which she loved too much to consider giving up. I wouldn't want you to, Nick told her when she mentioned it one evening. Your dedication to your patients is one of the things I admire most about you. For his part, Nick seemed to enjoy the simplicity she brought to his life. Home-cooked meals in her small kitchen, weekend hikes in nearby state parks, and quiet evenings with no agenda beyond being together. It was on one such evening, as they walked along the riverfront after a simple dinner at a local bistro, that Nick stopped suddenly and turned to face her. I've been thinking, he began, his expression unusually serious. That sounds dangerous, she teased, but fell silent when she saw the intensity in his eyes. From the moment I saw you sitting alone at that bar, looking like you wanted to be anywhere else, something told me you were going to change my life, he said, taking both her hands in his. I never expected to find someone like you, Nora. Someone who sees me, not what I have. Nora felt her heart begin to race as Nick reached into his pocket and lowered himself to one knee. I'm not asking because of grand gestures or romantic settings, he continued, his voice steady despite the vulnerability in his eyes. I'm asking in this ordinary moment because that's what I want, a lifetime of ordinary moments that become extraordinary because we're sharing them. He opened a small velvet box to reveal a ring with a single perfect diamond. Nora Harmon, will you marry me? The simplicity and sincerity of his proposal brought tears to her eyes. Yes, she whispered, yes, I will. The next months were a whirlwind of planning and preparation. Despite Nick's resources, they agreed on a relatively small wedding at his Napa Valley vineyard, with only their closest friends and family in attendance. Nora was touched by how Nick insisted on incorporating elements that were meaningful to her, her grandmother's lace handkerchief sewn into her dress, her favorite wildflowers in her bouquet, and the music that had been playing during their first dance included in the ceremony. On the morning of their wedding, Nora stood by the window of the villa's master suite, looking out over the vineyard where in just a few hours she would become Nick's wife. The journey from that unexpected dance to this moment felt both surreal and absolutely right. A soft knock at the door preceded Melissa's entrance. "How's the bride?" she asked, carrying a garment bag containing Nora's dress. "Happy," Nora replied simply. "Nervous, but happy." "You should be. Not everyone finds a millionaire who looks at them the way Nick looks at you," Melissa teased. "Though I'm still miffed you didn't let me introduce you to him months earlier when I met him at that fundraiser for the children's hospital." "Would you have mentioned he was a millionaire?" Nora asked, already knowing the answer. "Of course! That would have been my opening line." "Then I'm glad we met the way we did," Nora said firmly, without any preconceptions. As she walked down the aisle later that day, Nora saw nothing but Nick waiting for her, under an arbor draped with wisteria and roses. The look on his face, a mixture of awe, love, and absolute certainty, confirmed everything she felt in her own heart. Their vows were personal and heartfelt. Nick spoke of finding unexpected love when he least expected it, of how her compassion and authenticity had shown him what truly mattered in life. Nora promised to stand by him through whatever challenges came their way, to remind him of life's simple joys, and to never take for granted the love they had found. As they shared their first dance as husband and wife, Nick pulled her close. "Remember when you told me you never planned to dance that night?" he murmured. "Best unplanned decision of my life," she replied, resting her head against his chest. "Mine too." The years that followed were filled with the blend of ordinary and extraordinary moments they had both wanted. Their first home together was a compromise, a beautiful but not ostentatious brownstone in the city that allowed Nora to continue her work at the rehabilitation center and gave Nick a reasonable commute to his company headquarters. They traveled sometimes to glamorous destinations for events related to Nick's business or charity foundation, but more often to places they simply wanted to explore together. They hiked the Inca Trail to Machu Picchu, spent a month in a cottage in the English countryside, and took cooking classes in Thailand. Through it all, they maintained the balance they had established early in their relationship. Nora continued her career, eventually opening her own specialized physical therapy practice with Nick's encouragement and support. He remained at the helm of his company, but made changes to ensure he wasn't consumed by work, delegating more responsibilities and being selective about which projects truly required his personal attention. Their first major test as a couple came 3 years into their marriage when Nick's company faced a crisis. A promising sustainable energy project had failed spectacularly, causing significant financial losses and a temporary but sharp decline in the company's stock value. The stress was evident in Nick's furrowed brow and the late nights he spent trying to mitigate the damage. "Talk to me," Nora urged one evening when she found him staring at financial reports at 2 a.m. "Let me help, even if it's just by listening." He looked up, the weariness in his eyes giving way to gratitude. "You're already helping more than you know," he said, reaching for her hand. "Coming home to you keeps me grounded." Together, they weathered the storm. Nick was transparent with his investors about what had gone wrong and presented a clear plan for recovery. Nora stood by his side at press conferences and stakeholder meetings, her quiet presence a reminder of what was constant in his life, regardless of business fluctuations. When the crisis passed and the company emerged stronger for having faced adversity, Nick made a decision. "I'm stepping back," he told Nora over dinner one night. "Not retiring, but restructuring, so I'm not in the trenches every day." "Are you sure?" she asked, knowing how much his work meant to him. "Absolutely," he replied with conviction. "This situation showed me that, while I love building and creating, I love our life together more. I don't want to miss any of it because I'm too caught up in boardroom battles." It was shortly after this decision that they began discussing starting a family. The timing felt right, both were established in their careers, their relationship was solid, and they had created a home filled with love and stability. Nature, however, had other plans. After a year of trying without success, medical tests revealed that conceiving naturally would be unlikely for them. The news hit hard, particularly for Nora, who had always envisioned motherhood as part of her future. "We have options," Nick assured her, holding her through tearful nights. And whatever path we choose, we'll walk it together. They explored those options thoroughly: fertility treatments, surrogacy, adoption. After much soul-searching and discussion, they decided to pursue adoption, feeling drawn to the idea of providing a loving home for a child who needed one. The adoption process was both challenging and illuminating. They attended parenting classes, underwent home studies, and prepared themselves emotionally for the journey ahead. Through it all, their partnership deepened as they confronted questions about what kind of parents they wanted to be and how they would blend their different upbringings into a cohesive approach to raising a child. When they received the call that they had been matched with a newborn girl whose young mother had chosen them specifically after reading their profile, the joy was overwhelming. They flew across the country to meet the baby, who had been born just 2 days earlier. "She's perfect," Nora whispered as she held the tiny bundle for the first time. The baby had a shock of dark hair and solemn eyes that seemed to take in everything around her. "Just like her mother," Nick said, his voice thick with emotion as he watched his wife with their daughter. They named her Lily after Nora's grandmother and brought her home to a nursery that they had prepared with equal parts hope and trepidation. The early days were a blur of feedings, diaper changes, and sleep deprivation, but also moments of pure wonder as they watched their daughter discover the world. "I never knew I could love someone this much," Nick confessed one night as they stood together over Lily's crib, watching her sleep. "It's terrifying and amazing." "That's parenthood," Nora replied with a tired smile. "Terrifying and amazing in equal measure." As Lily grew from infant to toddler to a spirited young girl, their family expanded again this time, through the unexpected opportunity to adopt a 3-year-old boy named Ethan, whose caseworker had reached out knowing they had been open to adopting siblings or older children. Ethan's integration into their family had its challenges. Having spent his early years in foster care, he was wary and sometimes difficult to reach, but with patience, consistency, and unwavering love, they gradually earned his trust. The day he first called Nora Mommy without prompting was a milestone they celebrated with happy tears and ice cream sundaes. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Nick surprised Nora with a return to the hotel where they had first met. The charity gala was being held there again, and he had arranged for them to attend. "For old time's sake," he explained as they entered the ballroom where their story had begun a decade earlier. "Though this time, I'm hoping you'll dance with me without hesitation." "I think that can be arranged," she laughed, taking his hand. "Though I'm a bit out of practice with these heels." As they moved together on the dance floor, Nora was struck by how much had changed and yet how familiar this felt, being in Nick's arms, moving to the music, feeling that same connection that had surprised her all those years ago. "Any regrets?" Nick asked softly, echoing a question they sometimes posed to each other at significant moments. Nora thought about their life together, the challenges they had faced, the joy they had found, the family they had built. She thought about the woman she'd been that night, sitting alone at the bar, and how she could never have imagined where accepting one dance would lead. "Not a single one," she answered truthfully. "You?" "Just one," he said, his expression serious before breaking into a smile. "I wish I'd spotted you sooner that night. I wasted at least an hour when I could have been falling in love with you." Later that evening, as they stood on the terrace where they had talked until the early hours on the night they met, Nick handed her a small wrapped package. "What's this?" she asked, turning the box in her hands. "Open it and see." Inside was a delicate silver bracelet with 2 charms, a pair of dancing shoes, and a tiny heart. "To remind you that the best things in life are often unplanned," Nick said as he fastened it around her wrist. "Thank you for dancing with me that night, and every day since." "Thank you for asking," she replied, echoing her words from their first dance as she reached up to kiss him under the same stars that had witnessed the beginning of their journey together. As they drove home later to relieve the babysitter and check on their sleeping children, Nora reflected on how life's most meaningful paths often begin with the smallest of steps, or in her case, with a dance she had never planned to take. The unexpected turn that had led her to Nick, to their children, to the life they had built together, had taught her that sometimes the best futures are the ones we never see coming.